The silence in Abiquiu, New Mexico, was the kind that settled into bones like winter cold, except it was July of 1867, and the heat shimmered off the dusty streets in waves that made the abandoned buildings look like they were breathing. Delilah Owens stood in the doorway of the general store where her father had once measured out flour and sugar for the miners and ranchers who passed through, and she watched a tumbleweed roll past the church where 23 bodies lay buried in a mass grave behind the whitewashed walls. The fever had come with a traveling merchant in early June, burning through the small settlement like wildfire through dry grass, and when it finally released its grip 3 weeks later, Delilah was the only soul left standing in a town that had once held nearly 200 people. She had been 20 years old when the fever came, helping her mother tend the boarding house they ran above the general store, and now at 20 she felt ancient, hollowed out like the empty buildings that surrounded her. Her dark hair hung in a braid down her back, and her calico dress hung looser than it had a month ago because eating alone seemed pointless most days. She had survived because she had caught the fever early, been one of the first to burn through it, in those terrible days when her mother had pressed cool cloths to her forehead and forced broth between her cracked lips. By the time Delilah recovered enough to stand, her mother was sick, then her father, then everyone else, one after another, until the only sound in Abiquiu was coughing and crying, and then, finally, nothing at all. She had buried them herself, those she could manage. The undertaker had been one of the first to go, and the carpenter who might have made coffins died 2 days later. Delilah wrapped bodies in sheets and dragged them to graves she dug with blistered hands, and when she grew too weak and there were too many, she asked God to forgive her and let the remaining dead rest where they fell. She had pulled the doors shut on the boarding house, on the saloon, on the homes of people she had known her entire life, and she tried not to think about what was inside. Now it was 3 weeks since the last death, and Delilah was beginning to understand that being the sole survivor was a different kind of dying. She rationed the food from the general store and the other shops she broke into, though there was more than enough to last her years. She collected water from the well each morning and evening. She talked to herself to remember what her voice sounded like. She walked the perimeter of town every day at noon, telling herself she was keeping watch, but knowing there was nothing to watch for. No one would come to Abiquiu. Word would have spread by now about the fever town, and travelers would give it a wide berth for fear the sickness still lingered in the air. On the morning everything changed, Delilah was in the church. She went there most days, not because she felt particularly close to God anymore, but because it was the coolest building in town, and the silence there felt different than the silence everywhere else. She sat in the front pew where her family had sat every Sunday, running her fingers over the carved wood where her younger brother had once etched his initials when he was 8 years old. Thomas had been 14 when the fever took him. He had been the last one she buried, and she had sung every hymn she knew over his grave because their mother had always said music helped souls find their way to heaven. She was singing now, softly, something her mother had taught her when she heard it. The sound was so foreign, so unexpected, that at first her mind could not make sense of it. Hoofbeats. The steady rhythm of a horse moving down the main street of Abiquiu, and it was coming closer. Delilah stood so quickly the hymnal she had been holding clattered to the floor. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she moved to the church door, pressing herself against the frame as she peered out into the bright morning. At first the sun was too brilliant and she could only see a dark shape, man and horse moving together. Then her eyes adjusted, and she saw him clearly. He was the biggest man she had ever seen, sitting astride a massive roan horse that looked like it had been built to carry his size. Even from a distance she could see the width of his shoulders, the thick muscles of his arms bare beneath a worn leather vest. His hair was dark brown and fell past his shoulders, tied back with a strip of rawhide, and a full beard covered the lower half of his face. He had a rifle across his saddle and a knife at his belt, and he moved with the easy confidence of someone who feared very little in this world. Delilah's first instinct was to hide. She had been alone so long that the sight of another human being was almost frightening, like seeing a ghost or a memory made solid. But she had also been alone so long that the desperate ache for human contact overrode her fear, and before she could think better of it, she stepped out onto the church steps. The man saw her immediately. His hand went to his rifle, not drawing it but ready, and he pulled his horse to a stop about 30 feet away. They stared at each other across the dusty space, and Delilah saw his eyes tracking the empty street, the closed doors, the absence of any other living thing. "You should not be here," she said, and her voice came out rough from disuse. "The fever came, everyone is gone." The man dismounted in one smooth motion, his boots hitting the ground with a solid thud. He was even bigger standing than he had been on horseback, easily over 6 feet tall, with the kind of build that came from years of hard living in wild places. He did not come closer, but he studied her with eyes that were a startling light blue against his sun-darkened skin. "How long?" His voice was deep, gravelly, like he did not use it much either. 3 weeks since the last one died," Delilah said. "A month since it started." He nodded slowly, still watching her. "You are alone?" "Yes." "You are sick?" "I was. At the beginning, I survived it." He was quiet for a long moment, and she could see him thinking, weighing something in his mind. Finally, he said, "I am Dalton Quade. I live up in the mountains." He gestured vaguely north, toward the peaks that rose purple and distant in the morning light. "I came down for supplies 2 months back. Heard there was a settlement here. Meant to come sooner, but a rock slide took out part of the trail." "There is nothing here now," Delilah said. "Just me and the dead." Dalton Quade looked around again, and she saw something shift in his expression, a tightening around his eyes that might have been sorrow or might have been anger at the unfairness of the world. "What is your name?" "Delilah Owens." "Delilah Owens," he repeated, as if testing how it sounded. "You cannot stay here alone." She almost laughed, but it came out bitter. "Where else would I go?" "Anywhere." He took a step closer, and she noticed he moved carefully, like he was approaching a spooked horse. "The nearest town with people still breathing in it is Santa Fe. 3 days' ride east. You have family there? Friends? No family anywhere now. And I cannot just leave. This is my home." "This is a graveyard," Dalton said, and though his tone was not unkind, the words still hit like a blow. "You are going to die here if you stay. Maybe not today, maybe not next month, but eventually. A woman alone in an empty town? Something will happen. Raiders, drifters, sickness, accident. You know I am right." Delilah wanted to argue, but she could not find the words because he was right. She had been trying not to think about the future, about what happened when winter came, or when the stores ran out of food, or when something broke that she could not fix alone. She had been living day to day, hour to hour, because looking any further ahead made the darkness close in too tight. "I cannot just abandon them," she said quietly. "My family, everyone, they are all here." Dalton was close enough now that she had to tilt her head back to look at him. Up close, she could see the small scars on his hands and forearms, the weathered quality of his skin, the way his eyes had the 1,000-yard stare of someone who spent most of his time looking at horizons. He smelled like leather and wood smoke and the clean scent of pine. "They are gone," he said gently. "Staying here will not bring them back, but leaving might keep you alive. Why do you care?" The question came out more defensive than she meant it. "You do not know me." Something flickered across his face, gone too quick to name. "I know what it is like to be alone," he said. "I know what it does to a person, and I know that when you have a chance to keep someone from that fate, you take it." They stood there in the street, the sun climbing higher and the heat beginning to press down like a physical weight. Delilah felt tears prick her eyes, the first she had allowed herself in days, because hearing another human voice, having someone look at her with concern instead of the blank stare of fever-glazed eyes, made something crack open in her chest. "I do not know how to leave," she whispered. Dalton reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and placed one large hand on her shoulder. The touch was solid, warm, real. "One step at a time," he said. "That is all anyone can do." She nodded, not trusting her voice, and he let his hand drop. "I came down for supplies," he said, switching to a more practical tone. "Flour, salt, coffee, ammunition if there is any. My cabin is about 8 miles north, up in the high country. It is a hard ride, but I make it in summer. Come back with me. Stay until you figure out what you want to do next. At least you will not be alone." "You would take in a stranger?" Delilah asked. "You are not a stranger anymore," Dalton said simply. "You are Delilah Owens, the woman who survived when no one else did, and I am Dalton Quade, The man who came down the mountain so you would not have to be alone anymore. Seems pretty simple to me. Despite everything, Delilah felt the smallest hint of a smile tug at her lips. I do not have a horse. We will find you one. Town this size must have had a stable. There had been a stable, and there were still 3 horses in it, somehow still alive because Delilah had been bringing them water and hay from the feed store even though she had no idea what else to do with them. Dalton looked them over with a practiced eye and selected a sturdy mare with gentle eyes. He saddled her using tack from the stable, moving with the efficient grace of someone who had done this 10,000 times, and then he helped Delilah gather what she needed. She went back to the boarding house one last time, climbing the stairs to her small room under the eaves. She packed a bag with clothes, her mother's Bible, her father's pocket watch, a small painting of her family that had hung over the fireplace. She stood in the middle of the room and said goodbye to everything she had known, and then she walked out and did not look back. Dalton was loading supplies onto a pack horse he had tied behind his roan. He looked up when she emerged and nodded, taking her bag and securing it to the mare's saddle. You ready? No, Delilah said honestly, but I do not think I ever will be, so we might as well go. He helped her mount, his hand steady on her waist, as he lifted her into the saddle like she weighed nothing. She settled herself, gripping the reins with hands that had forgotten how to ride, and watched as Dalton swung up onto his own horse. They rode out of Abiquio heading north, and Delilah did not let herself turn around to see the town receding behind them. She kept her eyes forward, on the mountains that rose ahead, on the broad back of the man who had appeared out of nowhere, and offered her a lifeline when she had been drowning, in silence and grief. The trail was steep and rough, winding up through scrubland that gave way to pine forest as they climbed. Dalton set a steady pace, not too fast but not dawdling either, and he checked over his shoulder regularly to make sure Delilah was keeping up. She was saddle sore within an hour, her legs and back protesting the unaccustomed exercise, but she gritted her teeth and said nothing. She had survived a month alone in a dead town. She could survive a ride into the mountains. They stopped at midday beside a narrow creek that tumbled down over rocks, the water cold and clear. Dalton dismounted and came to help Delilah down, catching her when her legs nearly buckled under her. Easy, he said, steadying her. It has been a while since you rode? Years, Delilah admitted. My father sold our horses when I was 16, said we did not need them anymore. Dalton nodded and guided her to a flat rock near the water. He unpacked some jerky and hardtack from his saddlebag and handed her a portion, then filled a canteen from the creek and offered it to her. The water was shockingly cold and tasted like stone and snow, and it was the best thing she had drunk in weeks. How long have you lived in the mountains? She asked, needing to hear a voice even if it was her own. 5 years, give or take, Dalton said. He sat on a nearby boulder, long legs stretched out in front of him, and bit off a piece of jerky. Came out from Missouri after the war. Did not have a taste for settled life anymore. You fought? Union Army. 3 years. He said it flatly, like he was reporting the weather, but she could see the shadow that passed over his face. Saw enough of people killing each other to last a lifetime, wanted somewhere quiet. And you have been alone up there all this time? Mostly. I come down a few times a year for supplies, sometimes sell furs or meat to traders. But yeah, mostly alone. He looked at her and his expression was careful. It suits me, but I know it is not for everyone. What made you come down this time? Delilah asked. Needed salt, mainly. And I heard there was a new settlement in Abiquio. Thought I would check it out. Did not expect. He trailed off, shaking his head. Did not expect what I found. They were quiet for a while, eating and listening to the creek. Delilah watched a hawk circle overhead, riding the thermals, and wondered what it saw when it looked down. 2 tiny figures beside the water, alone in all that wilderness. What will I do at your cabin? She asked finally. Dalton shrugged. Whatever you want. Help with chores if you feel like it. Rest. Figure out your next move. I am not expecting anything from you, if that is what you are worried about. She had been worried about that, actually, though she had not wanted to say it. A young woman alone with a strange man in an isolated cabin could expect certain things, certain demands. But there was something in the way Dalton spoke, the straightforward honesty of it, that made her believe him. Why did you offer to help me? She asked. Really? He was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "I had a sister, younger than me. When I came back from the war, I found out she had died of cholera while I was gone. She was alone when it happened, husband had left her, family could not get there in time. I always thought about how scared she must have been, dying alone like that." He looked at Delilah, and his eyes were infinitely sad. "When I saw you standing there in front of that church, looking like a ghost in an empty town, I thought of her. Thought maybe if I had been there for her, someone else would have been kind to her. So I am being kind to you. Seems like the least I can do." Delilah felt her throat tighten. "I am sorry about your sister." "Me too." He stood, brushing crumbs from his pants. "We should keep moving. Want to make it back before dark." They rode through the afternoon, climbing higher and higher until the air grew thin and cool despite the summer heat. The pines grew thick and tall, and Delilah could hear the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the call of birds she could not name. It was so different from the dead silence of Abiquiu that it made her heart ache and soar at the same time. As the sun began to dip toward the western peaks, Dalton led them off the main trail onto a smaller path that was barely visible among the trees. They followed it for another half-mile, and then the forest opened up into a small clearing, and there was the cabin. It was larger than Delilah had expected, built from massive pine logs with a stone chimney rising from one end. There was a small barn to one side, a lean-to for firewood, and a vegetable garden that looked surprisingly well tended. Smoke rose from the chimney, which confused her until she remembered Dalton saying he had come down for supplies 2 months ago. He must have left a fire banked in the stove. "Home," Dalton said simply. He dismounted and came to help Delilah down, and this time she managed to keep her feet under her. He led the horses to the barn, showing her where the feed and water were, and together they unsaddled the animals and rubbed them down. Inside, the cabin was neat and spare but comfortable. There was a main room with a wood stove, a table and techniques, a rocking chair near the fireplace. A ladder led to a loft space under the eaves, and a door at the back opened onto a small bedroom. Furs covered the floors and the bed, and the walls were lined with shelves holding supplies and a surprising number of books. "You can have the bedroom," Dalton said, setting her bag down inside the door. "I usually sleep in the loft anyway." "I cannot take your room," Delilah protested. "You can and you will," Dalton said firmly. "I am not having an argument about it. You have been through enough without sleeping on a hard loft floor." She was too tired to argue, and truthfully the bed looked impossibly inviting. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for all of this. I do not know how to repay you." "Do not need repaying," Dalton said. He was already moving to the stove, stoking the fire and setting a pot of water on to boil. "You are here, you are safe, that is enough." That night, Delilah lay in Dalton's bed, wrapped in furs that smelled like him, and listened to the sounds of the mountain night. Wind in the pines, the hoot of an owl, the creak of the cabin settling, and from the loft above the quiet sound of Dalton's breathing, steady and even. For the first time in a month, she was not alone. For the first time in a month, she slept without nightmares. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that was both strange and comforting. Delilah woke each morning to the smell of coffee and found Dalton already up, tending to chores or making breakfast. He was a man of few words, but he was not unkind, and he seemed content to let her find her own way in this new life. She helped where she could, learning to tend the garden and feed the chickens he kept in a coop behind the cabin. She cooked meals from the supplies he had brought back from Abiquiu, grateful to have someone to cook for again. She read books from his collection, discovering he had a taste for Shakespeare and Dickens alongside practical manuals on trapping and woodcraft, and slowly, carefully, she began to heal. Dalton was gone some days, checking his trap lines or hunting for meat. He always told her where he was going and when he would be back, and he always returned when he said he would. Delilah began to trust the rhythm of it, the reliability of his presence. He treated her with respect, never overstepping, never making her feel uncomfortable. If anything, he seemed almost cautious around her, like he was afraid of scaring her away. One evening, about 2 weeks after she had arrived, they were sitting outside the cabin, watching the sun set behind the mountains. The sky was on fire with orange and pink and deep purple, and the air smelled like pine sap and wood smoke. Dalton was whittling a piece of wood, his hands moving with unconscious skill, and Delilah was mending a tear in one of his shirts. "Can I ask you something?" she said, breaking the comfortable silence. "Go ahead. Why do you really live up here alone? It cannot just be about the war." Dalton's hand stilled on the wood. He was quiet for a long moment, and she thought maybe she had pushed too far. But then he said, "After my sister died, I did not see much point in being around people anymore. Everyone I loved was gone, and I was tired of losing people. Up here, I do not have to worry about that, cannot lose what you never let yourself have." Delilah set down her mending. "That sounds lonely." "It is," Dalton admitted, "but it is safe." Or it was. He looked at her, and there was something in his eyes that made her breath catch. "Then I met you, and I am starting to think maybe safe is not the same as living." "What do you mean?" He went back to his whittling, but his jaw was tight. "Forget I said anything. It is not fair to put that on you." "No, please," Delilah said. She shifted closer, close enough that their shoulders were almost touching. "Tell me." Dalton sighed and set down his knife and wood. "You have been here 2 weeks, and this cabin feels more like a home than it has in 5 years. I find myself looking forward to coming back from the trap lines because I know you will be here. I listen for your voice, your footsteps, and I know it is too soon, and I know you are still grieving, and I have no right to feel anything. But I do. I care about you, Delilah, more than I should." Her heart was hammering in her chest. "Dalton, you do not have to say anything," he said quickly. "I know this is not what you signed up for. I told you I would help you figure out your next move, and I meant it. If you want to go to Santa Fe or anywhere else, I will take you there. I just needed you to know. Needed to be honest." Delilah looked at him, really looked at him, at the strong lines of his face, the vulnerability in his eyes, the way his hands were clenched on his knees like he was bracing for rejection. This man who had come down from his mountain to save her from her loneliness, who had given her safety and kindness without asking for anything in return. And she realized that somewhere in the past 2 weeks, she had stopped seeing him as just her rescuer. She had started seeing him as a man, and not just any man, a man she was falling for. "What if I do not want to go anywhere?" she said softly. He turned to her, hope and disbelief warring on his face. "What? What if I want to stay here with you?" "Delilah, you do not have to say that. I am not trying to trap you or make you feel obligated. I know you are not." She reached out and took his hand, feeling the calluses on his palm, the strength in his fingers. "I am saying it because I mean it. These past 2 weeks have been the first time since the fever that I have felt like maybe I can survive this. Not just survive, but actually live, and that is because of you." "You barely know me," Dalton said, but his hand tightened around hers. "I know you are kind. I know you are honest. I know you came down from this mountain to help someone you had never met, and you have not asked for anything in return. I know that when I wake up in the morning, I feel safe because you are here. Is that not enough to start with? What about what you lost? Your family? Your home?" "I will always carry them with me," Delilah said. "But I cannot bring them back, and I cannot spend the rest of my life mourning. They would not want that. My mother used to say that the best way to honor the dead is to live well, so that is what I want to do, live well. And I think maybe I could do that here, with you." Dalton stared at her for a long moment, and then he did something she had not expected. He smiled. It transformed his face, softening the harsh lines, lighting up his eyes, and she realized he was beautiful in a rugged, untamed way. "If you are sure," he said, "I am sure." He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently, and the touch sent warmth flooding through her. "Then stay," he said. "Stay as long as you want. Forever, if you will have me." "Forever sounds good," Delilah whispered. They sat there as the sun finished setting and the stars began to emerge, hand in hand, and Delilah felt something she had not felt since before the fever. She felt hope. The relationship between them shifted after that night, but it was a gradual thing, a slow building of trust and affection. Dalton did not rush her, did not push for more than she was ready to give. But there were small changes. He started sitting closer to her in the evenings. She would wake sometimes to find him watching her from across the room, and when she caught him, he would smile and look away. They found excuses to touch, passing a cup of coffee, working together in the garden, brushing against each other in the narrow confines of the cabin. One afternoon, about a month after she had arrived, They were working on repairing a section of fence around the chicken coop. Dalton was driving posts into the ground with a mallet, and Delilah was handing him the rails. It was hot work, and he had shed his shirt, and she found herself distracted by the play of muscles across his back and shoulders, the sheen of sweat on his skin, the casual power in every movement he made. "You are staring," Dalton said without turning around. Delilah felt her face heat. "I am not. You are." He looked at her over his shoulder, grinning. "It is all right. I do not mind." "You are impossible," she said, but she was smiling too. He set down the mallet and turned to face her fully. "Come here." She went to him, and he pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her waist. She could feel the heat coming off his body, smell the salt and musk of him. Her hands came up to rest on his chest, feeling the steady thump of his heart beneath her palms. "I want to kiss you," Dalton said quietly. "Is that all right?" In answer, Delilah rose up on her toes and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, exploratory, learning the shape and taste of each other. Then Dalton's arms tightened around her, and he deepened the kiss, and Delilah felt something ignite inside her. She had been kissed before, fumbling teenage kisses behind the schoolhouse, but this was different. This was a man who knew what he was doing, and who cared about her pleasure as much as his own. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Dalton rested his forehead against hers. "I have been wanting to do that for weeks," he admitted. "Why did you wait?" "Wanted to make sure you wanted it too." "I do," Delilah said. "I really do." They finished the fence repair in a haze of new awareness, stealing glances and touches whenever they could. That night, after supper, Dalton built up the fire, and they sat together on the bearskin rug in front of it. He pulled her back against his chest, wrapping his arms around her, and she leaned into him with a sigh of contentment. "Tell me about your family," Dalton said, "if you want to." Delilah was quiet for a moment, gathering her thoughts. "My father was a good man," she said finally, "stern but fair. He believed in hard work and honesty. My mother was the opposite, always laughing, always singing. She could find joy in anything, and Thomas, my brother, he was just starting to figure out who he was going to be. He wanted to be a blacksmith, used to spend all his time at the smithy watching old Mr. Patterson work. They sound like good people. They were." She turned in his arms to look at him. "What about you? Tell me about your sister." "Her name was Margaret," Dalton said. "Meg, everyone called her. She was 4 years younger than me, and she was fierce, stubborn as hell. When I left for the war, she cried, but she understood. Said she was proud of me." His voice roughened. "When I got back and found out she was gone, I felt like I had failed her, like I should have been there." "You could not have known," Delilah said gently. "I know, but knowing does not make it hurt less." "No," Delilah agreed, "it does not." They held each other in the firelight, two people who had lost everything and somehow found each other. And slowly, piece by piece, they began to build something new. The summer deepened into August, and Delilah settled into mountain life. She learned to recognize the signs of weather changing, to tell edible plants from poisonous ones, to shoot Dalton's rifle with reasonable accuracy. He was a patient teacher, never condescending, always willing to explain or demonstrate. And she discovered she had a knack for it, this wild life. Her hands grew calloused and strong, her body lean and capable. She felt more alive than she had in years. One morning, she woke before dawn to find Dalton's side of the bed empty. They had been sharing the bed for the past 2 weeks, though they had not yet taken things beyond kissing and holding each other through the night. Delilah knew Dalton was holding back, waiting for some signal from her that she was ready for more, and she loved him for his patience even as her own desire grew stronger each day. She found him outside, watching the sunrise paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. She wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and went to stand beside him, and he pulled her close without a word. "It is beautiful," she said. "It is," Dalton agreed, "but not as beautiful as you." She laughed. "That is terrible. I know. I am not good at this." He turned to face her, his expression serious. "But I mean it, Delilah. You are the most beautiful thing in my life, and I want you to know that I love you. I am in love with you." Her breath caught. They had been dancing around the words for weeks, but hearing them spoken aloud made them real, made them powerful. "I love you too," she said. "I think I have for a while now. Yeah?" Dalton kissed her, slow and deep. and she felt her body respond, heat pooling low in her belly. When he pulled back, his eyes were dark. "I want you," he said, his voice rough. "But only if you are ready, only if you want this too." "I want this," Delilah said. "I want you." He lifted her into his arms like she weighed nothing and carried her back into the cabin, kicking the door shut behind them. He laid her on the bed with a gentleness that belied his size, and then he was beside her, kissing her mouth, her jaw, the sensitive spot beneath her ear. His hands moved over her body, learning the shape of her through her nightgown, and she arched into his touch, craving more. They undressed each other slowly, taking time to explore, to memorize. Delilah ran her hands over the broad expanse of Dalton's chest, tracing the scars he carried from the war and his years in the wilderness. He was all hard muscle and warm skin, and she could feel the restraint in him, the way he was holding himself back. "You will not hurt me," she whispered. "I trust you." Something in his expression shifted, and he lowered himself over her, skin to skin, and it was everything she had been craving. He was careful with her, attentive, making sure she was ready before he joined their bodies together. There was a moment of discomfort, but then pleasure, building and building until she cried out his name and shattered in his arms. Afterward, they lay tangled together, hearts racing, skin damp with sweat. Dalton pressed kisses to her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "Are you all right?" he asked. "More than all right," Delilah said. She felt boneless, satisfied, utterly content. "That was, yeah," Dalton agreed, grinning. "It really was." They spent the rest of the day in bed, making love and talking and dozing in each other's arms. It was the happiest day Delilah could remember, and when she said as much, Dalton promised her there would be many more. As summer turned to autumn, the aspens on the mountain turned gold and the air grew crisp with the promise of winter. Dalton began preparing for the cold months ahead, cutting and stacking firewood, hunting and preserving meat, making sure they had enough supplies to last until spring. Delilah worked alongside him, and together they built up stores that would keep them comfortable even in the deepest snows. One evening in late September, as they sat by the fire after supper, Dalton reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wooden box. He held it for a moment, turning it over in his hands, and then he looked at Delilah. "I made this for you," he said, offering her the box. She opened it carefully and found a ring inside, carved from a piece of dark wood and polished to a shine. It was simple and beautiful, and she could see the care that had gone into its making. "Delilah Owens," Dalton said, and his voice was steady but his eyes were vulnerable. "I know we have not been together long, not in the way most people measure these things, but I have never been more sure of anything in my life. I want to spend every day I have left with you. I want to build a life here, raise a family if we are blessed, grow old watching the seasons change. Will you marry me?" Tears spilled down her cheeks, but they were good tears, joyful tears. "Yes," she said. "Yes, of course I will marry you." Dalton slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly. He kissed her then, pouring everything he felt into it, and she kissed him back with all the love in her heart. They married a week later, just the two of them in the clearing in front of the cabin. Delilah wore her mother's dress, altered to fit, and Dalton wore his best shirt and pants. They spoke their vows to each other as the sun set and the first stars appeared, promising to love and honor and cherish for all their days. There was no preacher, no witnesses except the mountains and the sky, but Delilah had never felt anything more sacred. That night, as they lay together as husband and wife, Delilah thought about how far she had come. 5 months ago, she had been alone in a dead town, convinced she would die there. Now she was here, in the arms of a man who loved her, building a new life from the ashes of the old. The grief was still there, would always be there, but it no longer defined her. She had survived. She had found love. She had found home. Winter came hard to the mountains that year. Snow piled up outside the cabin, sometimes 3 or 4 feet deep, and the wind howled like a living thing through the pines. But inside, Delilah and Dalton stayed warm. They spent the long dark months reading to each other, playing cards, making love by firelight. Dalton taught her to carve, and she made him laugh with her terrible first attempts. She taught him the songs her mother had taught her, and his deep voice harmonizing with hers filled the cabin with music. In January, the worst of the winter storms hit. For 3 days, the wind screamed and the snow fell so thick they could not see the barn from the cabin windows. They stayed inside, keeping the fire going, rationing their supplies just in case. On the fourth day, the storm broke, and they woke to a world transformed, everything buried under a blanket of pristine white. Dalton went out to check on the animals while Delilah made breakfast. When he came back, stamping snow from his boots, he had a strange look on his face. "What is wrong?" Delilah asked. "Nothing is wrong," Dalton said. "But I found something, or rather, she found me." He opened his coat, and a tiny black and white puppy poked its head out, shivering and mewling. "Found her in the barn," Dalton explained. "Must have been denned up with her mother when the storm hit, but the mother is gone. This little one is the only survivor." Delilah took the puppy carefully, cradling it against her chest. It was so small, could not have been more than a few weeks old. "Poor thing," she murmured. "She is half frozen." They spent the day nursing the puppy back to health, feeding it warm milk and keeping it close to the fire. By evening, it was perking up, yipping and trying to explore on wobbly legs. Delilah laughed as it tumbled over its own feet, and Dalton watched her with soft eyes. "We are keeping her," Delilah announced. "I figured," Dalton said, grinning. They named the puppy Scout, and she quickly became a beloved part of their little family. She grew fast, turning into a rangy mix of collie and wolf, loyal and protective. By the time spring came, she was big enough to accompany Dalton on his trap lines, and he swore she was the best hunting dog he had ever seen. Spring brought a thaw, and with it, new life. The clearing around the cabin burst into bloom, wildflowers carpeting the ground in brilliant colors. The creek ran high and fast with snowmelt, and the air smelled like growing things. Delilah spent hours working in the garden, planting seeds they had saved from the previous year, coaxing new growth from the dark earth. One morning in May, she woke feeling strange, her stomach unsettled. At first, she thought maybe she had eaten something that disagreed with her. But when the feeling persisted for several days, she began to suspect the truth. She waited another week to be sure, and then one evening after supper, she told Dalton. "I think I am with child," she said. Dalton froze, his coffee cup halfway to his lips. "You are sure?" "As sure as I can be without a doctor. I have missed my courses, and I have been feeling sick in the mornings. And I feel different." He set down the cup very carefully, and then he was across the room, pulling her into his arms. "A baby," he said, wonder in his voice. "We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Delilah asked, suddenly uncertain. "Happy?" Dalton pulled back to look at her, and his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Delilah, I am more than happy, I am. I do not even have words. You have given me everything. A home, a family, a reason to wake up in the morning. And now this?" He placed his hand gently over her still flat belly. "This is more than I ever dreamed I would have." She covered his hand with hers. "I am scared," she admitted. "What if something goes wrong? What if I cannot do this? You survived a fever that killed everyone else in your town." Dalton said firmly, "You came to live on a mountain with a man you barely knew. You made it through a winter that would have broken most people. You can do this, Delilah, and I will be with you every step of the way." The pregnancy was not easy. Delilah was sick for months, barely able to keep food down, and there were days when she was too exhausted to get out of bed. But Dalton was true to his word, caring for her with infinite patience, bringing her broth and cool water, rubbing her back when it ached. As her belly grew, he would sit with his hand resting on it, talking to the baby, telling it stories about the mountains and the life they would have together. In November, with the first snows beginning to fall, Delilah went into labor. It was long and difficult, and there were moments when she was sure she would not survive it. But Dalton stayed with her, holding her hand, wiping her face with a cool cloth, telling her she was strong, she could do this just a little longer. And then, finally, a baby's cry filled the cabin, thin and indignant. Dalton cut the cord with shaking hands and wrapped the baby in a clean blanket, and when he placed the tiny bundle in Delilah's arms, she looked down into the red, wrinkled face of her son and fell completely in love. "It is a boy," Dalton said, his voice rough with emotion. "A boy," Delilah repeated. She touched the dark fuzz on his head, the tiny, perfect fingers. "Hello, little one. I am your mama." They named him Daniel, after Dalton's father, and he was the joy of their lives. Dalton was a devoted father, rising in the night to walk with the baby when he fussed, changing diapers without complaint, singing lullabies in his deep voice. Delilah watched him with their son, and fell in love with him all over again. The years passed, each one bringing its own challenges and joys. Daniel grew into a sturdy toddler, curious and fearless, always getting into things he should not. When he was 2, Delilah discovered she was pregnant again, and this time the pregnancy was easier. Their daughter was born in the spring, a tiny thing with her mother's dark hair and her father's blue eyes. They named her Margaret, after Dalton's sister, and she was the most peaceful baby Delilah had ever seen. With 2 children, the cabin was too small, so Dalton spent that summer building an addition, 2 more rooms that gave them space to breathe. He also built a proper schoolroom, determined that his children would be educated, even living as far from civilization as they were. Delilah taught them their letters and numbers, read to them from the books on Dalton's shelves, and told them stories about the family they would never meet but who lived on in memory. When Daniel was 6 and Margaret was 4, Delilah suggested they might go down to Santa Fe for supplies and to let the children see a proper town. Dalton was hesitant at first, unused to the idea of leaving his mountain, but he agreed. They made the journey in early summer, and it was strange for both of them to be around so many people after so long in isolation. But the children loved it, wide-eyed at the bustle and noise, and Delilah found herself enjoying it too. They bought supplies, visited a doctor to make sure the children were healthy, and even stayed a night at a hotel. But by the second day, both Delilah and Dalton were ready to go home. The town felt too crowded, too loud, and they missed the quiet of their mountain. On the ride back, with the children dozing in their laps, Dalton said, "I am glad we came, but I am glad we are leaving too." "Me too," Delilah said. "I think we have made a good life up there." "The best life," Dalton agreed. He reached over and squeezed her hand. "Thank you for what?" "For saying yes that day. For staying, for building this with me." "Thank you for coming down the mountain," Delilah said softly. "For making sure I would not be alone." They smiled at each other, a shared understanding passing between them, and continued home. More children came, 2 more sons and another daughter, until the cabin rang with noise and laughter. The oldest, Daniel, grew into a young man with his father's size and his mother's kindness. He took over more of the heavy work as Dalton's hair began to gray, and he was a gentle big brother to his younger siblings. Margaret became a skilled healer, learning about plants and medicines from books Dalton brought back from his rare trips to town. She had a gift for it, and neighbors from surrounding homesteads would sometimes make the trek to their cabin seeking her help. The younger children were still small, but they were growing fast, learning to hunt and trap and read and think. Delilah watched them all and marveled at the life she and Dalton had created from nothing. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Dalton took Delilah up to a high meadow he had discovered years ago but never shown her. They left the children in Daniel's care and hiked up through the forest, emerging into a clearing carpeted with wildflowers and surrounded by towering peaks. "I have been saving this place," Dalton said as they stood together, looking out over the vista. "Wanted to share it with you on a special occasion. It is beautiful." Delilah breathed, "Not as beautiful as you." Dalton turned to her, and even with the gray in his hair and the lines around his eyes, he was still the handsome mountain man who had ridden into Abikio all those years ago. 20 years, Delilah. Sometimes I still cannot believe you chose me." "I will always choose you," she said. "In any life, in any circumstance. You saved me, Dalton. In every way a person can be saved." "You saved me too," he said. "I was half dead up here, just going through the motions. You gave me a reason to live." They kissed there in the meadow, surrounded by wildflowers and mountains and sky, and Delilah thought about the path that had led her here. The fever that had taken everything, the loneliness that had nearly broken her, and the man who had ridden down from his mountain because he could not stand the thought of her suffering alone. She thought about her parents, her brother, all the people of Abikio who had died that terrible summer. She carried them with her still, in her heart, in the stories she told her children. But she had also built something new, something beautiful and lasting. She had honored them by surviving, by thriving, by creating a family that would carry on long after she was gone. The years continued to pass, marked by seasons and celebrations, hardships and triumphs. Daniel married a girl from a neighboring amidst, and they built their own cabin a few miles away, close enough for family dinners. but far enough for independence. Margaret followed her calling and became a respected healer throughout the region. The younger children grew and found their own paths. Dalton and Delilah became grandparents, their cabin once again filled with the sounds of children, this time their children's children. They aged together, their bodies slowing, but their love as strong as ever. They still sat by the fire in the evenings, holding hands, talking about everything and nothing, and every day, Delilah was grateful for the man who had come down from the mountain and changed her life. One evening, when they were in their 60s and the last of their children had moved out to start their own lives, Dalton and Delilah sat on the porch watching the sunset. Scout had long since passed, as had two more dogs after her, but the current dog, a young shepherd named Bear, lay at their feet. "Do you ever regret it?" Dalton asked. "Staying here? You could have gone to Santa Fe or anywhere. Had an easier life." "Never," Delilah said firmly. "This has been exactly the life I was meant to have, with you. Even with all the hardship, the isolation. Especially because of those things," she said. "They made us stronger. And besides, I was never isolated. I had you." Dalton lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it, the same gesture he had made that first night they confessed their feelings. "I love you, Delilah Quade. I have loved you since the day I saw you standing in front of that church, and I will love you until my last breath." "And I love you," she replied, "always." They sat there as the sun sank below the mountains and the stars began to emerge. Two people who had found each other in the darkest of times and built a life of light. The fever had taken everything from Delilah once, but it had also, in a strange way, led her to Dalton, and from that tragedy had come decades of love, family, and joy. As they grew older still, their children and grandchildren made sure they were cared for. Daniel moved back into the cabin to help with the heavy work, and the grandchildren visited often, filling the rooms with laughter and energy. Delilah's health began to fail first, her heart growing weak, and there came a day when she could no longer leave her bed. Dalton barely left her side, holding her hand, talking to her, remembering all the years they had shared. Their children gathered around, and Delilah looked at each of them, seeing the legacy she and Dalton had created. 5 children, a dozen grandchildren, and more great-grandchildren than she could count. All of them alive and thriving because she had survived that fever, because Dalton had come down the mountain, because they had chosen each other. "I am not afraid," she told Dalton one night when they were alone. "I know," he said, his voice thick with tears, "but I am. I do not know how to be without you. You will not have to be without me for long," Delilah said gently. "We are both old, my love. But what a life we have had." "The best life," Dalton agreed. Delilah passed peacefully in her sleep a few nights later, Dalton's arms around her, just as he had held her every night for 40 years. They buried her in the meadow he had shown her on their anniversary, the high place with the wildflowers and the view of the mountains she had come to love. Dalton lived another 2 years, and though his children tried to care for him, everyone could see he was fading. He spent his days in the cabin he had built, surrounded by memories, talking to Delilah as if she were still there, and perhaps in some way she was. When his time came, he was in the bed they had shared, looking out the window at the mountains. Daniel was with him, holding his hand, and Dalton's last words were, "Tell her I am coming. Tell her to wait for me." They buried him beside Delilah in the meadow under a towering pine, and the entire family gathered to say goodbye. But it did not feel like an ending. It felt like a completion, a story that had been told fully and well. Years later, when Daniel was an old man himself, he would tell his grandchildren the story of how their great-grandparents had met. He would tell them about the fever that took everyone, about Delilah standing alone in an empty town, about the mountain man who rode down because he could not bear for her to be alone. He would tell them about the love that grew in that cabin in the mountains, the family that was built from grief and hope, the life that proved it was possible to survive the darkest times and find joy on the other side. And when the children asked if it was a true story, Daniel would take them to the meadow where his parents were buried, show them the cabin that still stood strong after all those years, and say, "Every word, and the best part is, it did not end with them. It continues in all of us, in every choice we make to love instead of hide, to hope instead of despair, to reach out instead of pulling away." That is their real legacy. Not just our family, but the lesson they taught us. that even when everything is taken away, even when you are alone in a dead town with nothing left, there is always a chance for new life. You just have to be willing to take it. The cabin in the mountains still stands, maintained by generations of the Quade family, and sometimes, on quiet evenings when the sun is setting and the wind whispers through the pines, you can almost hear them. Delilah's laughter, Dalton's deep voice, the sound of children playing, the echo of a life well lived, a love that conquered loneliness, and a story that began with tragedy but ended with triumph, because that is what Delilah and Dalton proved in the end. That love is stronger than loss, that hope can bloom even in the darkest soil, and that sometimes the person who saves you is the one who comes down from their mountain of solitude, because they cannot stand the thought of you facing yours alone, and if that is not a story worth telling, worth remembering, worth living by, then nothing is.